Hello everybody, so I'm here with Glen Weyl, he's in the office of the Chief Technology Officer at Microsoft. He's a political economist and a social technologist within that office. He's also the founder and chair of RadicalxChange Foundation and the author of a wonderful book titled Radical Markets. So thanks for being here. I know we're headed off to a talk with our students. But first question for you. So in Radical Markets, you study the functioning of markets, and actually you have some suggestions about how to improve that functioning. So if you could tell us a little bit about your work in that space and the main ideas and concepts in Radical Markets, I think it'd be wonderful.
Yeah, so the basic idea of Radical Markets is that we think that we live in a free market society, but in fact, our markets are pervaded by monopolies. And that private property itself, which is so core to how we usually think about markets, actually creates those monopolies. And it argues that we can actually have a much more free market system, paradoxically, through the common ownership of property, through a system where things are continually up for auction and the revenues of those auctions are returned to the public. And by doing so, we actually make a much more competitive market in the control over assets, but the value gets returned to the public as a whole. So actually, by moving away from private property towards some notion of more common property, we actually have a more dynamic and competitive market system.
Is there any market out there that you see today that looks a little bit like the markets you suggest, or no? Are they?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in fact, if you look at Google and Facebook, the way that they auction off ads, it's exactly based on this principle. You know, we're so used to private property and land that we don't think about the fact that on Facebook and Google, every keyword and all the advertisements on it, every moment, there's an auction going on for the right to list your ad there. And of course, you could instead sell, like you do for a billboard, the right to have that billboard. But that's not what they do. They have this continual auction type process. And you also see that in Singapore. So Singapore, property turns over every couple or 3 years, and there's an auction to turn it over to its new best uses. So what's usually called the power of compulsory purchase is used constantly to maintain things flowing to their best uses.
On the Facebook example, but your thesis would be that it would make more sense for that to be public and for the auction to take place in a public platform, or no?
Well, in general, I believe that governance happens at many different levels. So platforms govern themselves internally, and they need to in turn be governed by public authorities in different ways. And so I think what we can do is learn some lessons about how to better administer public resources from some of the mechanisms that are being innovated in the private sector, and we can continue to improve on them as well and bring those to the private sector.
Let me ask you a question. I want to ask you about the functioning of political markets and politics. But before I get to that, just a question on this issue of markets and competition, because we've been having a growing debate, particularly in Europe, with the functioning of platforms and with some of the figures and data that comes out of the functioning of our markets, actually, that seems to point to an oligopolistic, if not monopolistic force within some of these markets. So we know this from market concentration figures. I don't know if you know this, but the rate of churn of companies, the birth and death of the companies in the US is at historically low levels. The M&A activity of some of these platforms is extremely high as well. So if you take all of the diffusion of productivity growth, seems to be stalling, so some companies seem to have concentrated most of the productivity growth of the last few decades. So anyway, all of this is building to a huge narrative that basically says we have a competition problem in the digital economy. And nobody really knows how to tackle this. I mean, do you tackle this through, first of all, do you buy the diagnosis that this is an issue, or maybe it's not an issue? And the second is, if it is an issue, how do we tackle this, right? Do you break them up? Do you impose data portability to allow for competition on the data piece, but maybe not on the infrastructure? So how do you, what's your thinking around these things? Because it's going to be...
Yeah, so overall, first of all, I think that there's a bunch of things that antitrust has been missing and can do better on. I think it's been missing the power of institutional investors. That's a whole interesting story that I think plays an important role here. I think it's been missing the role of market power over workers. Usually we focus just on consumers. I think it's been missing some of this tech stuff. However, I don't think that's the main solution. I actually think the main solution is moving beyond the standard antitrust and competition framework to think about what I would call economic democracy. So I think that, there's a famous quote by the guy who created antitrust law, which said that we shouldn't tolerate a king of an industry any more than we should have a king of a country. But we didn't deal with kings of countries by getting rid of the country or breaking it up. We dealt with the king of the country by creating a democracy. And in the same way, I think we need institutions that increasingly take these platforms, which have network effects, which are genuinely beneficial, and try to give power to the people who are dominated by the platforms to have voice in the control over those platforms. And a lot of the work that I do focuses on that as ways of building flexible and responsive cross-jurisdictional democratic institutions to check the power of these platforms rather than just breaking them up.
Which would undo all of the network effects on the others, right?
Exactly,
So the question on the functioning of political markets and of politics, because you've also done some very interesting work in that space, and also on mechanisms on how to improve democratic processes. And here there's another fascinating debate that I think your work plugs into, which is the debate about the legitimacy and efficacy of democracy. And a lot of people, I think, tend to not focus on this or not see it, but actually as an IR, as an international relations person, one of the things that I see very clearly is that the global debate is now dominated by this question, is democracy legitimate and effective, or are there other models out there that are better? And some people actually portray, for example, the Chinese model as a data-driven, AI-driven model, where you can infer behavior, not just behavior, you can check behavior and infer preferences without the need for people to express their will in democratic processes, right? So this big debate is sort of the backdrop to some of your work. So I'd be very curious to know about how you see these things.
Well, I think, as I mentioned, markets can actually be more effective and more competitive by moving beyond the narrow notion of private property that's underlay them. In the same way, I think that democracy can be better and more effective and more flexible by moving beyond the rigid notion of one person, one vote that underlies it. So democracy, I think, needs to allow people to express when things are especially important to them, and needs to allow for cross-jurisdictional, flexible, and emergent forms of democracy rather than ones that are based on fixed, historical boundaries. And those are the sorts of things we're working to empower. So for example, we have this idea called quadratic voting, where you sort of get a budget of tokens that you can use to allocate across different issues and candidates for and against, and it has a particular structure where it gets more expensive each additional vote, the more votes that you have on something. And this has some nice properties to it, but it's really one part of a broader strategy of how do we actually fit the structures of democratic governance that we have to the structures of the public good problems we're facing, rather than to some historical boundary that happens to exist, which might not line up at all with the issues that we're actually facing.
But the historical boundary, you mean in terms of political rights as well? So you would empower, you would enfranchise people beyond the natural frontiers of the polity, or how?
Yeah, I mean, I believe in what Elinor Ostrom called polycentric governance. I think eventually we need to have a world with many, many different layers of governance cutting across each other in different ways, flexibly emerging and adapting in the same way that enterprises do to new market segments, but in a democratic sense, rather than in a sense that's driven by capitalist profit and so forth.
And do you see anybody or anywhere doing experimentation in this field that is exciting? And I mean at the policy level. I don't mean sort of in the academic world or the research world, but actually at the policy level. Because one of my concerns is that in fact the system is quite rigid when it comes to substantive reform in most of these democracies. For example, something like changing those that have the power to vote or to express a binding opinion on the direction of the polity, that is extremely sensitive, right? I mean, just think about the European case, how complex the debate about sovereignty has been, how much is placed at what level. So do you see anybody taking this seriously?
I think things always start small and they grow, but yeah, we've seen some really interesting experiments. Taiwan, I think, is probably the most interesting jurisdiction in terms of experiments with democracy under the leadership of their digital minister, Audrey Tang. She's been doing all sorts of different ways of engaging citizens. The legislature of the state of Colorado actually used quadratic voting to allocate their budget this year. The Volt Party in Germany used quadratic voting to do their platform this year. I'm meeting with lots of political parties, and I think there's going to be some exciting developments coming in terms of the way things are going. And I'm actually really heartened that we had this populist wave, and I think it's starting to ebb a little bit, and we're seeing sort of in its wake emerge a sort of new green liberal politics in the center, which I think is quite open and experimental, and that really recognizes the need for new types of democratic international governance if we're going to have any chance of meeting the climate challenges, the migration challenges, the lack of democratic legitimacy. So I'm cautiously optimistic that there are forces starting to emerge.
I hope that there's a lot more work done in this space, and also work that integrates emerging technologies into this discussion, right? Because we seem to be losing part of this debate to other types of regimes, and particularly authoritarian and illiberal regimes that see in technology the possibility or the tool to get information about what people would want or seem to want without the need of empowering. And actually this is sort of like a full-on attack on agency, right? On individual agency, and the underlying narrative, I find it very toxic.
I agree, and I don't think it can be separated from the narrative about technology itself, because I actually think technology is not some external and exogenous process that just goes along and that we have to react to. The vision of technology is itself a vision of society. And a lot of the rhetoric around AI and automation, I think, comes from a very totalitarian type of a mindset where things are just going to be done for you. Whereas, you know, in this group that I have at Microsoft and the work that I do at RadicalxChange, we're trying to envision a future for technology that enables human collaboration, communication, and creativity rather than supplanting human beings. And so I think, technologists and social thinkers have to work together to imagine that future and to build it. And I think that, that's the sort of work that I hope you guys will be doing here at IE.
Yeah. No, we're thinking about these things, and we're quite concerned about some of these trends, because also when you connect the trends about surveillance and data, these data-driven policies that are very elitist and not very porous to public opinion, and when you add to that the advances in our knowledge of neuroscience and behavioral sciences, then you start to realize what a danger it is to in fact use these technologies with an illiberal purpose, right?
Yeah, well, and I think that the worry that I have is, a lot of the debate has gotten bifurcated into the AI thing and then the ethics of AI thing that just wants to constrain AI, rather than fusing them into saying, no, we can actually have more powerful technology if we harness the distributed intelligence of all the people on the planet, rather than just focusing on the intelligence of a small number of people in Silicon Valley. I think that actually pluralism can be more powerful than centralized authority, but only if we're willing to optimistically and creatively work with technologists and social scientists to build that powerful, interconnected, pluralistic society. And that's the future that I think we need.
Wonderful. Well, Glen, thanks a lot. Thanks for being here. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I wish you a lot of luck in the work that you're doing, and we'll do our best to circulate it and make it well known, because I think it's an essential issue. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.